Mrs. Turner sat at her desk, staring out the window as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the empty classroom. The walls were covered in faded posters of historical figures and motivational quotes, remnants of a time when she believed she could change the world, one student at a time. But those days were long gone. Now she was just counting down the weeks until retirement. The sound of raised voices snapped her out of her trance. She glanced up as the door burst open and the assistant principal, Mr. Hargrove, marched in, dragging a girl by the arm. It was the usual suspect, Ava Moore, the school's resident troublemaker. Her hair was dyed a vivid purple and she wore a scroll that could wilt flowers. "Caught her tagging the lockers again," Mr. Hargrove said, his voice dripping with irritation. "Third time this month. I thought you might want to handle this, Mrs. Turner, given your experience." Mrs. Turner raised an eyebrow, her lips twitching into the hint of a smile. She knew what he meant by experience. Ava reminded everyone of the young Mrs. Turner, the rebellious teacher who had once defied the school board and pushed boundaries. That was decades ago, before time and the weight of the system wore down on her. "Leave her with me," Mrs. Turner said, her voice steady. Mr. Hargrove hesitated but nodded, retreating with a sigh of relief. The door clicked shut, leaving the room in silence. Ava crossed her arms, staring at Mrs. Turner defiantly. "Go ahead," she said. "Give me detention or whatever. It's not like I care." Mrs. Turner leaned back in her chair, studying Ava with critical eyes. "You know, when I was your age, I would have said the exact same thing." Ava rolled her eyes. "Yeah, right. I mean it," Mrs. Turner replied, her voice softer now. "I was just like you, angry at everything and everyone, itching to break the rules. The only difference is I didn't have anyone to talk about it with." Ava's defiance faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of curiosity. "What happened?" Mrs. Turner shrugged. "I grew up, got a job, started following the rules because it was easier than fighting against them." Ava scoffed. "Sounds boring." "It is," Mrs. Turner said, a wistful smile on her lips, "and I don't want the same for you." Ava blinked, taken aback. She had expected a lecture, not a confession. For a moment she saw the woman behind the teacher, the person who had once been like her, before life smoothed out her rough edges. "You're not in trouble, Ava," Mrs. Turner said quietly. "But I think we need to talk." Ava frowned, caught off guard by the unexpected kindness. "About what?" Mrs. Turner leaned forward, her eyes sharp and clear. "About why you're really angry." Over the next few weeks, a strange bond began to form between Mrs. Turner and Ava. It started with casual conversations after class. When the other students had already left for the day, Ava would linger by the door, pretending to look disinterested, while Mrs. Turner finished grading papers. "What are you fighting against, Ava?" Mrs. Turner asked one day, setting her pen down and looking at the girl. Ava leaned against the wall, her arms crossed. "Everything," she muttered. "The rules, the expectations, the way everyone thinks I should fit into this neat little box." Mrs. Turner nodded. "I get it. You feel like you're drowning in a world that's already decided who you're supposed to be." Ava's eyes widened, the raw truth of the words hitting her like a punch to the gut. "Yeah," she whispered. "Exactly that." For the first time, Ava felt seen, and truly seen. It was unsettling, but also comforting in a way she couldn't explain. She began to open up, telling Mrs. Turner about her frustrations, her dreams, and her fears. She talked about her art, the graffiti she painted in hidden corners of the city, her only outlet of the feelings she couldn't put into words. Mrs. Turner listened, her expression thoughtful. "You have a gift," she said one day, looking at a sketch Ava had shown her. It was raw and emotional, a burst of color and energy on the page. "You shouldn't hide it." Ava shrugged. "It's just something I do. It's not like anyone cares." "I care," Mrs. Turner said firmly, "and I think you could do something with it, if you stop trying to sabotage yourself." Ava frowned, her defenses rising. "What do you mean?" "I mean that every time you get caught, it's because you want to be caught," Mrs. Turner said. "You want someone to notice you, to see that you're more than just a troublemaker." Ava looked away, her throat tight. "You don't know what it's like," she said, "to feel like you're screaming into a void and no one hears you." Mrs. Turner's face softened. "I do, Ava," she said quietly. "I felt the same way once, but instead of fighting for what I believed in, I gave up. I followed the path that was expected of me, and I lost myself along the way." Ava stared at her, searching her face of any sign of a lie, but all she saw was sincerity, the look of someone who understood. "What happened?" Ava asked. Mrs. Turner sighed. "I conformed. I became the person everyone expected me to be, and it's my biggest regret." For the first time, Ava saw Mrs. Turner not as a teacher, but as a person, flawed, real, and vulnerable. In that moment, she realized she had found something she didn't know she needed: a mentor. Mrs. Turner could feel the shift in her own heart, a slow unraveling of the resignation that had settled there over the years. The daily grind, the endless meetings, the bureaucracy of the school system had all drained her of her passion she had once had. But Ava's fire had sparked something in her, a reminder of the young woman she used to be. She found herself bending the rules in ways she never would have before. They started small, letting Ava stay after school to work on her art, slipping her a pass when she skipped a class she hated. But soon it escalated. One Friday afternoon, Ava dragged Mrs. Turner to a neglected part of the school grounds, hidden from the main building by a row of tall trees. "I want to show you something," Ava said, her eyes alight with a mixture of excitement and nerves. Mrs. Turner followed, curious. Ava led her to an old brick wall, half covered in ivy. But it wasn't the wall itself that made Mrs. Turner breath catch in her throat. It was what Ava had painted on it. A mural stretched across the bricks, vivid and bursting with color. It was a depiction of students, teachers, the school itself, but with a surreal, dreamlike quality. The faces looked up at the sky, where a single figure soared above them, arms outstretched like wings. "This is incredible," Mrs. Turner whispered, taking a step closer. "Ava, this is..." "Beautiful?" Ava interrupted, her tone challenging. "Or just more trouble?" Mrs. Turner turned to her, eyes shining. "It's honest," she said. "It's the truth of what this place could be, what it should be. It's your voice, Ava." Ava looked away, her expression softening. "They're gonna make me paint over," she said quietly, "as soon as they find out." "Not if I can help it," Mrs. Turner replied. Ava's head snapped up, disbelief written all over her face. "You'd stand up for me? For this?" "I would," Mrs. Turner said, surprising herself with the strength of her own conviction. "Because I should have stood up for myself a long time ago." The next Monday, the mural was discovered. The principal called Ava into his office, the stern tone in his voice making it clear he expected consequences. But Mrs. Turner was already there, standing by Ava's side. "This artwork isn't vandalism," Mrs. Turner argued. "It's a statement. It's something we should be proud of. Our students should be encouraged to express themselves, not stifled." The principal's face turned red with anger. "You're crossing a line, Mrs. Turner," he warned. "Maybe I am," she shot back, her heart pounding. "But I spent too many years watching lines get drawn and never once crossing them. It's about time I did." For the first time in decades, Mrs. Turner felt alive, and as she looked at Ava, she saw the same spark mirrored back at her. Mrs. Turner and Ava walked out of the principal's office together, the tension still hanging in the air. Ava was silent, her face a mixture of shock and admiration. She'd never seen a teacher stand up to the administration like that, let alone for her. "Why did you do that?" Ava asked once they were outside. "You could get fired." Mrs. Turner chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "I'm retiring soon anyway. What do I have to lose?" "Everything," Ava said softly. "Your reputation, your career, those things don't matter as much as I once thought," Mrs. Turner replied. They walked through the empty halls, the echoes of their footsteps filling the silence. "A long time ago, I had dreams, Ava. I wanted to change the world. I wanted to fight for what was right." Ava frowned. "Well, why didn't you do it then?" "I got scared," Mrs. Turner admitted. "I settled. I told myself it was enough just to be a good teacher, do my job and follow the rules, but in doing so, I lost my voice. I stopped standing up for the things that really mattered." They reached the mural, untouched for now, its colors bright even in the dim hallway light. Mrs. Turner reached out, tracing the painted face of a student reaching for the sky. "This mural," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's everything I gave up on. It's the voice I silenced in myself, but you still have yours, and it's powerful." Ava swallowed hard, the words hitting her like a punch to the gut. "You're saying you regret your life?" "I regret the moments I stayed quiet when I should have spoken up," Mrs. Turner said. "The times I let fear dictate my choices, and I don't want that for you." Ava looked down, her voice small. "I don't know if I can be what you want me to be." Mrs. Turner stepped closer, lifting Ava's chin with gentle fingers. "It's not what I want, Ava. It's about what you want. The world will try to tell you who to be, just like it did to me, but you have a chance I didn't take. Don't waste it." For a moment they stood there, two generations linked by shared struggles and unspoken dreams. Ava nodded slowly, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Thank you," she whispered. Mrs. Turner squeezed her hand. "No, Ava," she said. Thank you for reminding me who I used to be. The end of the school year came quickly. The days were filled with exams, paperwork, and the bittersweet goodbyes that come with every graduation season. For Mrs. Turner, it was different this time. She wasn't just saying goodbye to her students, she was saying goodbye to a part of herself. On the last day of school, she found Ava waiting for her in the empty classroom. A young girl held a small, wrapped package in her hands. "I got you something," Ava said, her voice uncharacteristically shy. Mrs. Turner took the package and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a simple frame with a photograph of the mural, taken just before the administration ordered it to be painted over. Beneath it, Ava had written, "For the teacher who helped me find my voice." Tears filled Mrs. Turner's eyes. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I wouldn't have done it without you," Ava replied. "You believed in me when no one else did." Mrs. Turner hugged her, feeling the weight of all the years, the regrets and the triumphs. "Listen to me, Ava," she said, pulling back to look the girl in the eyes. "Don't make the same mistakes I did. Don't silence yourself because it's easier. Channel that fire inside of you into something real, something meaningful. Follow your own dreams, not anyone else's." Ava nodded, her face set with a new determination. "I will," she promised. Mrs. Turner smiled, a sense of peace washing over her. She realized that this was a true legacy, not the awards on her desk or the years she put in, but the spark she reignited in a single student. As she walked out of the school for the last time, the photograph of the mural tucked under her arm, she felt lighter than she had in years. The sun was setting, casting the world in a warm golden light. For the first time, she wasn't looking back with regret. She was looking forward. And that, she realized, was the greatest lesson of all.